You're listening to Standing Before the Mast podcast with Chris Heaton, sponsored by Newport Nautical Supply.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. In this episode, we hear from John Taft about rum running along the coast of Rhode Island during Prohibition. Like me, John is a bit of a history enthusiast, and when he discovered that the boat he and his partners had purchased to run mansion tours turned out to be an actual former rum runner, he went down many rabbit holes researching not only the boat's history, but the history of all the rum running activities off the coast of Rhode Island and in Narragansett Bay. One of the things he discovered was that the boat they had refurbished was the actual boat that was involved in one of the most horrific and deadly conflicts with the Coast Guard during Prohibition. In our talk, John weaves the story of this deadly event, also known as the Black Duck Massacre, with the history, roots, logistics, and characters involved in the various enterprises. John also provides us with a wealth of information on the design and construction of the various boats that were used in the liquor smuggling operations in the mid to late 1920s. Near the end of the podcast, we talk a little bit about a film that he's involved in producing that documents the event. I'll provide a link at the end of the podcast with a website for that film, which also includes a trailer. As he mentions in our talk, the production is on hold at the moment due to COVID, but you can sign up to receive updates on that website. I had a great time talking with John and could have easily spent another hour asking questions. So if booze and you are legal where you're listening, and you're not operating a motor vehicle, heavy machinery, pregnant, or nursing, maybe pour yourself the beverage of your choosing and enjoy our talk.
Now you're going to ask me something?
Yeah. Okay, John. Yeah, that's how it works. Okay. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Sure thing. Good to be here, Chris.
We're going to talk about rum running and that sort of thing. But to start, how did you find the Rum Runner, the boat?
Well, this was back in the early 90s. Don Glassy and I had built the schooner Madeline up at Scarano Boat Building in Albany, New York. And we'd started running her, I think it was 1992, or it might have been 91 even. I think it was 91. You know, it was one of those, if you build it, they will come kind of deals. So all of a sudden we realized we had a customer base. And while we were up there, we had noticed this kind of semi-derelict, hogged motorboat under blue tarps. And it was looking pretty sad, but it had a kind of a cool hull. And it turned out it was an old ferry boat that was had been one of the ferries across Mccoy Bay down Long Island. And more recent to that had been used up in Seneca Lake, just as an excursion boat. But it had this god-awful, ugly house on the top of it. It was quite top-heavy, and somebody had kind of home-built this thing. But they were telling stories at the boatyard about it, that they used to tow 25 water skiers on it, on Seneca Lake, like a Cypress Gardens kind of routine. And we were like, you got to be kidding, because it was a pretty ungainly-looking craft, and it was powered at that time by a couple of 671 Detroits. And Don and I thought, well, this is cool, but my God, what a job. And John Scarano runs the yard up there. He was kind of enthralled with it as a project, and he said he'd work with us on it, and it had been Coast Guard inspected for many years. And we worked up a deal so that we would fix the boat up. And, during this discussion, it came out that it was actually built as a rum runner back in the late 20s. And the hull was an Elco hull. So we decided to look at this project in the sense that we're going to try to recreate somewhat the lines of it as a rum runner. Mm-hmm. Although when we got into it, we went and looked, and there's actually Rosenfeld photographs of the rum runner and some of her sister ships. She's one of four that were designed by Irwin Chase and built in the late 20s. And they were built as very Spartan craft. I mean, they were low silhouette, the flush deck, except for a small well aft, a small trunk cabin for the engines. We glitzed it up a little bit. We made it look more like a little bit of a commuter yacht sort of thing. And we had to put some creature comforts on it, so we have that canopy aft. put a couple of cat diesels in, and off we went.
So you repowered it.
Yeah. Well, she had those Detroits in her. And in our research, we found out the original power, and you could see actually there was a third engine, set of beds and the shaft log. And when we looked into it, the original power is 3 V-12 Liberty aircraft engines.
Oh God!
Yeah, which turns out these were that was the power plant of choice for all of these. I mean, this was really like the final evolution of the contact boat, or the shore boats, as they were called, and collectively referred to as the Mosquito Fleet. And, we'll get into it in terms of what role they played in the logistics of liquor smuggling. The idea with these craft that these were going to be, hard to see. And when you did see them, they were going to be fast. And interestingly enough, also, when you look in the plans, they had a kind of a sophisticated exhaust system, so they could either be above water exhaust to get the full power, or they could also run with an underwater exhaust system. And they also had provisions by that time, and this was a development again in the late 20s, to be able to, they had a little tank that they had a mixture of used engine oil, kerosene, and pyrene that they could inject into the exhaust manifolds to generate smoke screens. So,
wow.
So that was one of the techniques they used to evade the Coast Guard when they're being pursued.
And the boat you had, that particular one, was that originally called the Black Duck?
Well, we didn't know anything about rum running back then. We just thought, this is a cool boat. Right. And we liked it. And so we got it down to, we didn't get it to Newport until early 1993. Patricia was down there. It was kind of a bare bones operation with the running the excursion boat business. She was down there, and a couple of older gentlemen came up. The boat's down at the dock at Bannister's. And they came up and they said, "Is that the Black Duck?" And we're like, "What's this Black Duck?" we don't know anything about this Black Duck. Meanwhile, we're trying to sell mansion tours on this thing. We think the mansion tours are the way to go.
Go out and around, yeah?
Yeah, which nobody wanted to do because nobody wanted to go out in the morning when the seas are calm enough. And the boat is fast enough so it could book out there. And, you can see a lot in a very short period of time. But as soon as the southwest breeze comes in, you don't want to be taking people around Trenton Reef.
Right.
It doesn't work. And it really did not work at all. And then so we kind of redialed on the tour. Mm-hmm. And I had to go into the library and go to the old microfilms and find out what's this Black Duck stuff, and is Prohibition and Rhode Island smuggling history kind of a more appropriate direction for us to go in. And as I got into it, I realized, oh my God, we're going by the site of the Black Duck Massacre, as it's called by many. We go by that every day, many times. It's wow. This took place right off of Fort Wetherall. In fact, the Coast Guard boat that was involved in the ambush, Coast Guard Cutter 290, was tied up to the buoy off of Fort Wetherall. And the actual buoy location then on the charts was buoy number 9 is the one we reference to right now. Mm-hmm. But that location was actually probably 100 yards further north. And it was back then it was buoy number 1, and they called it the Bull Point buoy. So the Coast Guard cutter was tied up to that and was waiting for him. In our never-ending research, there's indications in Coast Guard intelligence reports that they had. I mean, the Coast Guard was very avidly breaking codes at that point. There was a lot of radio traffic used by both the Coast Guard and the rum runners, so that they could pick up rendezvous locations. And the Coast Guard was very good by that point in terms of they had a code breaking office in New York, and they were very good at breaking the codes and trying to identify which boats were involved and where their rendezvous points were and times, so that would give them an indication of where they would be coming in. But they were also cultivating human intelligence, so they were paying informants. So we actually have sheets. I think the informants were getting paid $2 a day, and for human intelligence. So they would sprinkle people around the neighborhood. We have some interesting reports about some guy hanging around the shipyard over in Fairhaven, chatting up a bunch of the rum boat captains and getting some intelligence that he's passing back to Washington. The Black Duck was coming in from meeting the British oil screw steamer Seymour and they picked up a load and were coming in, and it was it was the holiday season, and it was an unusual night because it was the night of December 28th, early morning December 29th, and it was pretty calm out, but it was a fog. Most of these boats, they would have a schedule predicated on the cycle, the lunar cycle, because if there was a lot of moonlight, they didn't want to go out because they get picked off easy. And again, this was the late 1920s. These guys had learned a lot of lessons the hard way, but they had a very well-evolved routine where the offshore boats even, they'd be up in Nova Scotia provisioning, and then they'd go up to St. Pierre and Miquelon, pick up their cargo, and then steam down so that they would arrive off of Rum Row just as you're getting, probably 10 days around the new moon so that they can take advantage of the moonless nights. But at the same time, they were looking at the weather patterns too. So if they're going to be even just cloudy skies, they could stretch either side of that. And foggy nights were perfect. And given that this was the holiday season, the demand was very high, which means the prices were higher. So the rewards would be commensurately higher. So that night, the Coast Guard had decided that they were going to mobilize all the boats at Base 4. The Coast Guard Base 4 was down in New London, Connecticut. And that's where all the patrol boats were based. At that time, they had a collection of about almost a dozen 75-foot patrol boats. And then they had a few 125s. And they also had about 10 old four-stack destroyers that they'd gotten from the Navy back in the mid-20s. The destroyers were meant for offshore patrols, and they would harass the fleet out on Rum Row. But the 75-footers would be more inshore, trying to intercept the contact boats as they were coming in. They got all the boats they could get afloat out there because they knew that they had this combination of a high demand period. It was a couple of days before New Year's Eve. So, and the conditions were perfect. There were actually two of the 75s out. One of them was over by Fort Adams, and then the 290 that actually intercepted the Black Duck was tied up stern to the buoy, which of course you could make the case saying, well, what were they doing tied up to the buoy? Nobody's supposed to tie up to a buoy,
right?
But it was the Coast Guard, and it was an outgoing tide, so they just tied up stern to, and they're just sitting there waiting, and then the Black Duck was coming up the Jamestown shore. Mm-hmm. And in the fog, of course, the first thing they see is the bow of a boat in front of them. So they bore off to port. So they're in between the Coast Guard boat and the rock there right off of Fort Weatherall. The guys in the Coast Guard boat just opened up with their Lewis machine gun and raked them with machine gun fire and killed 3 of the 4 guys on board. And I don't know how much detail we want to get into with this, because I can bore into this. You were talking about rabbit holes there.
I am curious what cove. I'm just looking at. I've got my app open here. Is it they call West Cove, and by Fort Weatherall, there's like 3 coves right there.
Yeah. So imagine that buoy about 100 yards north. The buoy right next.
I see it. Number 9. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So number 9 was, instead of number 9, they shifted the station, and maybe it wasn't even 100, maybe 75 yards. It was still pretty close to that rock. And so the Black Duck came in, left the rock to port, and there's some testimony to the fact that the Coast Guard may have tied off the bell on the buoy as well. Ooh. So they were really looking for that buoy. I mean, think about this. Okay, so these guys, they go out, and the typical routine is they've got to leave in mid-afternoon because their supply boat is hovering probably 30 miles out. Because they can't go maintain, the guys on Rum Row can't maintain station on the 12-mile limit because, their navigation's not that good, and the Coast Guard's going to come up and say, "Oh, you just broached the 12-mile limit. We're going to haul you in."
Right.
Seize the boat. So they would go out like 30 miles, and then they'd have a rendezvous point around the 12-mile limit. Up here, Rum Row, the most active area was, say, between Montauk and the Vineyard. Mm-hmm. Because when you look at that, it affords you a lot of opportunity for the boats to meet without getting in. Because you have, the line dips in between Block Island and No Man's Land for sure. Mm-hmm. So they can get a little closer there. But still, they got to go 12 miles past Block Island, essentially, just to get to the contact point. So they got to leave in the afternoon. And for a while, this was what the Coast Guard boats used to do, is they'd stop them on the way out. And they would do a safety inspection, which would inevitably find, oh, your port running light doesn't work. You know? Yeah. So you're busted. You know, we're going to give you a violation. And it's going to take us 5 hours to give you that violation. Of course, what that did was it ran the clock out on their trip, because the contact boats had to be able to get out to Rum Row and load up the booze and then bring that in. Now, their contact point is 12 miles past Block Island at the closest. And so now they've got to come back in. Now it's another, 15 miles to get up to the bay. And now they've got to navigate up to wherever they're going to unload, which is typically up the bay, because they don't want to unload on Aquidneck Island, because the choke point for getting the product off is the bridge. Right. Or the ferry. I mean, they're not going to do that. So they've got to get it up and anywhere from East Greenwich. Warwick Neck was a hotbed. I mean, that was like the preferred place. There was a lot of spots up around Warwick Neck. They also had the options, and one of the reasons why this area was such a great spot was there are so many options for bringing booze in. I mean, you've got the West Passage, East Passage, the Sconnet River, and there were even a lot of spots where they could unload in the right weather along the south beaches, and then you get up towards Buzzards Bay, and there's a huge number of spots up there as well. Each one of which was kind of controlled by a different. Well, I hate to use the word gang, but that's there are loose affiliations, at least on the water side. Sure. Once you got ashore, there are more organized operations and controlled by people who are connected to people in Boston or New York. And that's where it got to be more like the traditional gangster kind of thing that you see. But on the water, it was really... I mean, these guys on the water were different in the sense that they're great mariners, and they're taking significant risks every time they go out. So anyway, they'd be coming back with their loads, and now they've got to get up to an unloading point, which is like, for instance, maybe they're up by Rocky Point, which is a spot they liked. And now they got to get the boat unloaded in enough time before daybreak, so that the guys that are now assuming the cargo have to be able to get it to a barn or someplace where they're going to hide it so they can distribute it. So that's a very complicated evolution of operations. And if they don't get it all done in time, they're just going to run out of, the clock's going to run out on them. So the Coast Guard kind of knew that, what the time frame was for when these guys were going to come back in as well. They knew, okay, if they got to get out there at X time to pick up the load, they're going to be coming back into the bay somewhere between, say, they're not going to come up the bay any later than 3 a.m. Right. Because they're not going to have time to unload everything. So sure enough, it was I think it was 1:45 in the morning when the Black Duck showed up. And they were kind of, they're feeling their way up the Jamestown shore. I mean, all they have on board is a compass. I mean, these guys are good. They're good navigators, lots of experience. But they're still trying to home in on the buoy. And, of course, what's the Coast Guard boat's tied up to the buoy. And one of the aspects of this is a little crazy is the Coast Guard's use of their weapons. The 75s were equipped with a 1-pound cannon, the Hotchkiss Cannon, which is that's a 37 millimeter cannon, so it's about 1.5 inches bore. I mean, it was essentially a signal gun, and the primary use was for firing the traditional shot across the bow. And they carried a load of blanks, and then they carried live rounds as well. But even something that size, I mean, the typical contact boat was a 60-foot wood-hulled boat. You fire a 1-pound shot at it and hit, it's going to do some significant damage. Yeah. And they also carried either 1 or 2 Lewis machine guns mounted on deck, and these were it's a 30 caliber round, and these were developed in World War I. Actually, were used on some of the early biplanes before they came up with the machine guns that could synchronize with the propeller rotation. Mm-hmm. So initially, they would mount this on top of the upper wing, and the navigator would stand up, and he'd have to hold his hand up in the air and pull the trigger to shoot over the propeller, But this was very popular light machine gun used in the field. It had the nickname of the Belgian rattlesnake. Ooh. But it was an effective weapon. But the thing is, there's such a thing as rules of engagement, and the Coast Guard had very strict rules of engagement in terms of trying to get rum boats to stop. And they're supposed to fire a warning shot across the bow, and the warning shot across the bow was supposed to be with the 1-pound cannon. They were actually, almost every year they put out new rules of engagement, because every time they put out rules of engagement, the crews on the Coast Guard boats would ignore them, because it was a cat and mouse game out there, and they wanted to stop these guys. So if you see that old adage, if you give a guy a hammer for a tool, every problem looks like a nail. So they give him machine guns. Oh. And so, when the Black Duck hailed into view, she's coming up, and there's a lot of controversy. Was she doing 5 knots? Was she doing 25 knots? But in any case, she's coming in the fog. And when the guys in the Coast Guard boat can hear the Black Duck coming, because they've got their engines off. And the Black Duck doesn't know anything. Those guys don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so they come in, they see all of a sudden it looks like they're going to collide with something. They throw the helm to port. And of course, if you throw the helm to port at that location, you're going to drive into that cul-de-sac, basically, between Clingstone and Fort Wetherill. Right. You're just going to pile in the Bull Point. So they veer off to port, and within seconds of them coming into sight, the Coast Guard doesn't sound their klaxon. They say they shined a spotlight on their signal flag, which is another signal to stop. And they open up with a machine gun and rip off 20-something rounds. And then Black Duck disappears from sight. A couple of minutes later, Black Duck comes back out and tries to maneuver alongside, and bumps into the Coast Guard 290. And by this time, 2 of the 3 guys on board are dead, and the third was laying there dying. And the captain of the boat, Charlie Travers from Fairhaven, was shot in the hand. So he had still managed to get to maneuver the boat alongside. From there, they kind of spent some time just kind of cleaning things up. The Coast Guard wasn't in a big hurry to get over to Fort Adams. And later, there were claims that Jacob Weissman would have been able to be saved, but he died by the time they got over to Fort Adams. And they took the bodies off there, put him in the morgue temporarily. And then they hauled Charlie off to Newport Hospital and took the bodies over to Hambley's funeral home, which was on Man Street at that point, right across from the police station now, and towed the Black Duck down to New London. Charlie stayed in the hospital in Newport a couple of days. But that morning, Father Magoon, who was director of the Seamen's Church Institute, he also had a parish at St. George's, which was on Rhode Island Ave, which is right next to the parking lot where across next to the Newport Hospital. Mm-hmm. He was able to get into the hospital and speak to Charlie that morning. And then he came out and delivered a sermon ripping into the Coast Guard, condemning the murderous actions of the Coast Guard. And this sermon was quoted in the papers across the country. Wow. And this thing hit the front pages, and it was an incendiary. I mean, you got the public across the country was riveted by this thing because, I mean, basically the Coast Guard just ambushed these guys and, shot them down, cold blood. So, and this story goes on and on and on. And I really, so there's a question of which rabbit hole you really want to go down here, Chris.
Presumably they also took the contraband, I take it. Did they get contraband?
There were 327 cases of booze on the Black Duck. And one of the things these boats would do, they would carry dories on the aft deck, because the great thing about the dories, first of all, it was like a big container they use these things called hams. Mm-hmm. And a ham was a burlap sack with padding, straw, that they would use to, well, let me just go back a bit, because by this point, earlier during Prohibition, a lot of the booze would come up from the Bahamas or from the Caribbean. And Rum Row was actually started by this guy, Bill Mccoy. He's credited as being the pioneer of Rum Row. And he started out because he bought this old Gloucester fishing schooner in 1921. Prohibition started January 16th, 1920, officially. And right off the bat, there were people going up to Canada and smuggling booze in. And there were people going to the Bahamas. But it was very small scale, people on their fishing boats and things like that. So McCoy got the idea of getting a schooner, and he bought this up in Gloucester, the Marshall. And he started bringing in booze from Nassau. And he set up off of New York in 1921. And then the business was so good, he bought another schooner, the Arethusa. And he actually anchored the Arethusa off of no man's land. And back then, there was the 12-mile limit was a 3-mile limit. The 12-mile limit was instituted in the mid-20s, specifically because of Prohibition, and try to make it give the Coast Guard more opportunity to prevent the boats coming close to land. So McCoy was parked over off the Vineyard, and he was actually hanging around with the Aquina Wampanoags, and because they were kind of outlaws too, and then he would go into New Bedford and set up the deals. So because that was before it was an organized activity, he had just get the word out saying that, hey, I've got a boat out here full of booze. Why don't you guys come out and buy some? Right. And he actually took a newspaper man from the New Bedford Standard Times out with him, and showed him and said, look, I've got like thousands of cases of booze on this thing. Go back and tell everybody. And, in the Coast Guard then, they didn't have any resources to enforce this. I mean, they had a few cutters, but these were, vessels that were 10, 12 knots and spread pretty thin. So Rum Row took off from there. And before you knew it, there were just boats coming in from all over the place. I mean, they were coming over from Europe. A lot of Canadian boats were involved. Although Canada had their own version of Prohibition on a province-by-province basis. Mm-hmm. So, but their prohibition didn't prevent them from selling it to people taking it out of the country. So they were still manufacturing. See, the Prohibition Act here prevented any manufacture in the United States. That wasn't true in Canada. So then he got very busy very quickly, and he actually had a third boat by that point. And back then, the boats weren't sophisticated. They were just buying surplus Grand Banks schooners. Mm-hmm. But people started coming over from Europe, with old, World War I sub chasers and tramp steamers, all kinds of things, tired yachts, and they just load them up and bring them over. And then McCoy ended up having some trouble. He had an engine problem with the Arethusa, and he was off of Halifax. Because he had a load of booze, he couldn't bring it into Halifax because he had come up from Nassau. So he was trying to figure out what to do. And then somebody said, there's these 2 French islands off of Newfoundland, St. Pierre and Miquelon. You can go in there, no problem. So he takes the Arethusa up there, and everybody says, well, welcome to France. Because, they're part of France. And they were happy as a clam to take care of the Arethusa and sell him as much booze as he wanted with very low export duty, which was another key thing. And still they were making plenty of money if they did this. Now, Patricia and I went up there about 3 years ago, and these are just 2 rocky, crazy islands. And you're within sight of Newfoundland. It's about 7 or 8 miles across. They love showing people all the stuff, because the waterfront's lined with concrete warehouses that all have like 1926 or 1927 stamped over the doors. Wow! And these are all built as liquor warehouses during Prohibition. There's a railway, really nice railway, right in the middle of town, and because this used to be a big cod fishing port, and they said that's where we hauled the Arethusa, right there. So excellent. Yeah. And there's houses up there that have additions made out of like liquor boxes that were broken down. There's one cottage they call it. That's the Cuddy Sark cottage, there's a hotel, the Hotel Robert, that of course, they all claim that Al Capone visited them there. I mean, well, who's to say? Al Capone's visited just about every place with any connection to liquor going, but, maybe he did. There's also claims he stopped at the Narragansett Hotel down, across the bay. So
right.
I don't know. So anyway, Mccoy ended up, he was the pioneer with all this stuff. Although, by the time things were getting crazy in the mid-20s, he decided to get out of it. He'd been arrested a couple of times, and his lawyers helped him a lot. And around this time, the law was a very malleable thing at that time for prohibition offenses. And if you spread your money around wisely, you could get a lot done. But
what consequences, just to go back to the incident where the Coast Guard shot the guys on the Black Duck, were there any consequences for those Coast Guardsmen, or were they considered doing their job?
This wasn't the first time there had been fatalities involved. It was one of the more dramatic ones. 3 of the 4 crew being killed, in seconds was a lot. Right out of the gate, Rhode Island, and just to back up a little, Rhode Island, Prohibition was not popular here. Rhode Island was generally considered a wet state. States were divided between the wets and the dries. The wets favoring repeal of Prohibition. It was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And so it had to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. Now, it turned out every state ended up ratifying the 18th Amendment except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the lone holdout. So there was no cooperation really between the federal and the state authorities here, and it was a federal enforcement effort by Coast Guard on land and the Customs Department once ashore. So immediately it was a little bit of a battle started between the state and the feds. The state attorney general actually wanted to get the Coast Guard guys back to Rhode Island, so in case they decided to charge them in this case. Now, whether it would be manslaughter or more serious charges remains to be seen, but this immediately started a real political effort between the feds and the state. On a federal level, it went all the way up. I mean, Secretary Mellon, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time, there's a number of letters that he wrote to the Attorney General to try to figure out how they could get out of this, and they ended up digging up a lot of arcane law related to the founding of the Coast Guard back when it was the Revenue Cutter Service. So they had documents from the 18th and 19th century trying to support the Coast Guard's actions in this case. There was the senators from Massachusetts and Rhode Island were raising holy hell about this in Washington. And there were a number of inquests held. The first inquest was the coroner's inquest. The coroner was a fellow by the name of Dawson. And that was actually started at the jail in Newport, which is the Jailhouse Inn. That was the jail and the Newport police station. And they started the initial inquest there. At the same time, there was a grand jury convened in Providence, and simultaneous with that, there was a Coast Guard inquest that was started down in New London. Coast Guard inquest actually generated a lot of material. They did the most thorough because they had access to everything, and they actually had ballistics experts trace bullet paths through the boat, so they could see the angle of where the bullets came in. And those are exhibits, and they're down in the National Archives. We actually got copies of those. They drew exhibits of the maneuvering pattern of the Black Duck and the 290 to show how, on a chart to show you the different speeds they may have been going and all that. So, but there was no way that the Coast Guard was going to let their guys go back to Rhode Island at this point. They were like, they're not going. So there was a real push-pull thing going on here, and it played out over several weeks. In the end, the state really, they didn't have a lot to work with in terms of getting the crew of the 290 back there for any kind of testimony. In the end, they dropped the chart. The grand jury found there was, quote, no true bill. That was their terminology for deciding not that they couldn't go on and find anything actionable here. But at the same time, the same grand jury remained convened because, of course, now they've got Charlie Travers, who had been wounded in the hand, the captain of the Black Duck. And the federal authorities declined to prosecute him. and he got off scot-free.
Wow.
Even though, I mean, his buddies have been killed.
Right. He lost his boat.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, these boats were funny things. It's kind of like the fishing boats. You know, usually the owner's not the guy on board.
Of course. Oh, okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different claims about who owned the Black Duck, and sometimes it's not even as simple as that. So, because sometimes you might have, I mean, we know it was registered in Jake Weissman's name. Well, it wasn't even. It was his address actually. It was registered to a fictional person, I mean, a John Williams, who happened to have the same address as Jake Weissman. But then it turns out there's a relative of Jake Weissman's who's in the Coast Guard intelligence reports as being the owner. And so, even so, I mean, okay, so he might have owned the boat, but Charlie very likely owned the engines. So it was one of those crazy deals.
Oh, wow.
You know, and these guys all work together on this stuff, you know. And that's one of the fascinating aspects of that. You've got this crazy cast of characters in the mariners and boat builders and designers who were involved. And in the course of this, one of the kind of the crazy things we found was that the person whose name keeps coming up was Walter McGinnis, the naval architect and boat builder. So Walter McGinnis, he got his start up at the Lawley Yard in Quonset, Mass. And it turns out that he designed the Tramp and the Black Duck. Now, the Tramp was a sister ship to the Black Duck. And Charlie actually got his, I'll get into Charlie's history a little bit. Charlie grew up in New Bedford. And when he was 16 years old, he lied about his age and joined the Coast Guard. And was stationed at Cuttyhunk and was on the surf boat station there. And did a year there and then got out and worked in the mills a little bit, did some fishing, did a fair amount of fishing, but that only lasted a year or two. And he got picked up by this guy, Frank Butler, who was part of the Tillman family. They're an old vineyard whaling bunch. There's a lot of whaling captains in the Tillman family, but Frank got his hands on the Tramp. So Charlie ended up cutting his teeth in the business, working as an engineer on the Tramp. And the Tramp was busted a few times, and every time Charlie was on board and they got seized, Charlie would give a false name, so his name never shows up. All these guys had a slew of aliases whenever they got arrested because, you know, there were no picture IDs back then. So
right.
you just tell, you know, one time he was Carl Brown, another time he was Carl White, Harry Scott, you know. So Charlie had started out there. Walter McGinnis built both of those boats, the Tramp and the Black Duck. Well, he designed them and got them started because they were started in late 1924. And then Walter got an offer of a job to run the Knox shipyard over in East Greenwich. At the Knox yard at that time, the Knox yard was becoming the place to go to get a fast contact boat. I mean, it was busy. They were cranking on this stuff. So they got Walter down there, and because he'd been creating a little bit of a name for himself doing that sort of work. And in those post-war years, I mean, this was prime work because these guys were paying top dollar for these boats because there was such a demand for them. So then Walter had just gotten started there, and the Lawley Yard was struggling and had to be reorganized under bankruptcy action. And Walter had an opportunity to go back to the Lawley Yard. So Walter actually he designed and was involved in the construction of those two boats. And then it turns out around the same time he started designing boats for the Canadians because, you know, the first generation of rum rowboats were kind of slow on gaining craft. There were the Grand Banks schooners and, you know, boats that had used up their viable life in the commercial world one way or another. So they started building custom-built transport boats so they could run the cargo up and down. You know, it was like a little version of the triangle trade. They'd build the boats and provision the boats, fuel the boats in Nova Scotia. Then they'd run up to St. Pierre and Miquelon, and they'd pick up the booze. And then they'd run down to Rum Row, which was the biggest rum row was off in New York. But second to that was the area south of Rhode Island, and then in a more limited way, Boston. Boston was more seasonal because, nobody wants to sit on station off of Boston in the middle of the winter because when those nor'easters come in, it's awful. But, you get down along the Rhode Island, if you sit offshore here, it's actually, it's more tenable at least,
right?
In that kind of weather. So McGinnis was building these transport boats up there. And it turns out that the boat that the Black Duck got their cargo off of, the Seymour, that was a McGinnis boat. And at the same time, McGinnis got busy building boats for the Coast Guard. And in fact, between 1932 and the Korean War, out of 15 classes of Coast Guard cutters, McGinnis designed 13 of them.
Wow.
And I remember years ago, and this was probably when we first got interested in this subject, I actually called Alan McGinnis, was Walter's son. And Alan had worked with Walter many years before Walter's death. Alan told me it was kind of funny because the Coast Guard they were very frustrated because they'd go to consult with him. He was the go-to guy because he really knew his craft for building boats that were good for this kind of activity. And they'd go in there and they'd see he'd, hurriedly thrown a bunch of papers over a set of plans for a rum boat. And on the other drafting table, they've got the plans for the Coast Guard cutters for them to review.
Right.
And they knew what he was doing. and those 75-footers were great boats. And finally, Walter ended up using those basic designs at the request of the first of his clients was the folks that built Lion's Whelp, which was which was loosely modeled after that, and then Black Knight, and then ultimately Hotchkiss built Urel. And so they were kind of all built on that same model of what the 75-foot patrol boat was. Sorry if I'm meandering around a little bit.
No, this is great. This is great. I just love the idea that it doesn't matter who your customer is. You're going to do the best work you can.
Yeah. And of course, the thing is, the Coast Guard was hampered because, their boats had to be out there maintaining station for long periods of time in all kinds of crazy weather. Whereas the rum boats, they could build them lighter. They only needed fuel to just zoom out and zoom back, although it was a lot of fuel.
Right.
Imagine some of these boats that had 3 Liberty V12s. The Rum Runner was designed with a 900-gallon gas tank.
Oh.
and this aviation fuel.
Sure.
Because these Liberty engines, they're originally designed for aircraft in World War I, and they had ramped up this big, even though the United States was a late entry to that conflict. When they ramped up the industrial capacity available then, they went whole hog. And so by the time the war ended, they had built over 20,000 of these V12 engines, almost none of which they had something to put them in. The aircraft development and construction just wasn't keeping pace with it. So a huge number of those got sold off as surplus after the war, which was like perfect for the rum runners. All of a sudden they have access to these cheap, powerful engines.
I can't imagine how loud it must have been.
Oh, running these things. Think about the noise level. And there are some old recordings we found, films of these boats. The Coast Guard would actually stage these PR events. So they'd show a Coast Guard cutter chasing a contact boat. And actually the Coast Guard, whenever they caught a particularly fast boat, they would reconfigure it as a Coast Guard vessel. So many of the Coast Guard vessels were captured rum boats. But yeah, the noise level was atrocious. And these were fussy craft. You think about an aircraft engine's meant to be overhauled on a very regular basis. They're very finely tuned. And just you had to have a full-time engineer on. Like, for instance, they wouldn't run out at speed to Rum Row because they just burn up all their fuel. So they would mosey out there at a more reduced speed. But by the time they got there, because they're running at a reduced speed, all the plugs are fouled. So now they've got to change all the plugs, which they would do, in transit.
And I imagine these are air-cooled engines, right?
No, they had to marinize them. And actually, Charlie Travers had a shop on Hillman Street in New Bedford, marinizing aviation engines. And the Liberties were only one of several engines that they chose to use for this. And they'd have to build their own water jackets, and they'd cast them. And we're talking about a lot of guys who are really savvy about machinery and coming up with great ways of solving problems. But even so, interestingly enough, the engines on the Black Duck weren't Liberties. They were Detroit Aero Marines, which were Marinized Fiat Zeppelin engines. So, it's crazy. I mean, these guys, they're cutting edge.
Now, this is a funny thing. I was doing my research for this, and my wife said, years ago, she works for a local print shop, and she said, we did some labels for a liquor called Black Duck. Is that any association? I said, I have no idea.
Well, Dawn and I would come up with some crazy schemes sometimes, but one night we came up with the idea saying, okay, we need our own rum company. So we actually were talking to the guys down in at Cruzan to see if we could work with them. But after a while we decided, well, all we have to do is just buy Cruzan. And at that time we were running Arabella down in the islands.
Sure.
And so whenever we were coming back up, we'd load up with, I can't remember if it was 100 or 200 cases of Cruzan. We were paying, I don't know, $4.50 a bottle.
Wow.
And then we would steam the labels off and just slap that label on. Of course, and the funny thing is, we were taking a little bit of a risk bringing all that booze up because we serve rum punch on the Rum Runner. And we thought, okay, are we going to do this legitimately? And it just seemed like too much of a pain in the neck. So the idea was we would bring up several hundred cases of Cruzan rum on Arabella every spring when she came back up from the islands. And then we would pull the Rum Runner up alongside, pile it on, go to Ann Street Pier, and unload it. And then we have a shop over at Christie's Landing. Yeah. And I was like, where are we going to store all this? And I realized, we have a crawl space underneath. So why don't we just cut a hole in the floor and we're going to put a hatch there and we would put it all underneath the floor. And I mean, we're just practically solving the problems, but at the same time, we're doing what anybody else back in the 20s would be doing.
Right.
And I always thought, well, if someday we might get caught doing this by customs, because I'm sure we're supposed to be, what we're doing is not legal at all in terms of just pulling this off. But then I thought, well, worst thing that happens when we get caught, we're going to get some great publicity out of this. We'll get some major mileage, but somehow we got away with it. Now we have to pay retail for the rum.
Oh, right. I once crewed on I want to say it was a little harbor. I shouldn't say crewed. It was a delivery, like a 60-foot little harbor, and it had a dedicated tank for rum with a tap. I found out about it because I asked why there was this third tap by the galley sink. It turns out that the owner fancied this particular kind of rum, and I don't know, I never got much further. I don't know if they poured individual bottles down. They had a deck fill. It had It was obscured by something else, but it had a deck fill, and I don't know if they poured individual bottles down it or if they bought it, I don't know, had it fueled like a big truck came. But they said it was I want to say it was a 25 or 30 gallon tank.
Yeah. Well, that you bring up an interesting question because these guys during Prohibition, I mean, they're smugglers. So you're going to try to think up every innovative way you can to try to get booze in without getting caught. In the meantime, your product typically comes in glass bottles. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like, I mean, that's an inconvenient way of handling stuff. And like when I mentioned earlier about the hams, what they would do in St. Pierre, you'd get cases, wooden cases of scotch, for instance. I mean, that's a real awkward thing if you're going to be on the pitching deck of an old schooner and you got to throw it down to some guys on a speedboat. Mm. I mean, that's an awkward thing to handle. So one of the industries in St. Pierre, and it was interesting, during the height of Prohibition, people were renting out their houses to store booze in because there was no space. Because first of all, it gets really cold up there. And even with a high alcohol content, I mean, a lot of these products didn't have there were a lot of champagne getting shipped through there as well. So they'd have to find places where they could keep it from getting too cold. But they had a small cottage industry of people that would just store the booze, and then they would dismantle the boxes and then pack it in the straw and then sew the burlap sacks tight around it. And so you would have anywhere from 6 to 12 bottles, but it was a package that was actually very easy to stack because they're kind of triangular in shape. So you could stack them very tight with very little wasted space. And you could pitch them down to people on deck very easily. And because there's multiple points, so they have to get transferred from shore to the schooner, from the schooner to the contact boat, from the contact boat to the guys on the beach, from the guys on the beach into the truck, and on and on. So there's multiple handling points here. So they've got to be able to create this stuff so that it can survive all that. But they were still using glass bottles in many cases. Now, there was a certain amount of activity bringing rum in casks, but a cask is a pretty awkward thing too,
Mm-hmm.
And that was mostly from the West Indies. But rum was not, even they were called rum runners. Rum was like the last product that you usually got brought in.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what was the predominant product that was aboard?
Well, whiskey was like big time. The Black Duck had, what was it? It was Golden Wedding Scotch. And that was actually manufactured in Canada by United
Golden
Distillery.
Wedding, that was what they called it.
Yeah.
It almost sounds rude.
It does. And Log Cabin whiskey was another one. I've actually got a bottle that came from the bottom of the harbor in St. Pierre. A Frenchman who actually had made a short film about St. Pierre and rum running gave it to me, and it was all barnacle encrusted. Interestingly enough, in St. Pierre, after Prohibition ended, they were stuck with a lot of these bottles of whiskey. So Bronfman's is the family that still owns Seagram's, but they were very involved in a lot of illegal smuggling activity. They sent barrels so they could put the whiskey back in the barrels to age it more, so they could get a higher price for it. So they took all these bottles and they threw them in the harbor. So I guess the bottom of the harbor is littered with old whiskey bottles. And so I've got one that's covered with barnacles who's been sitting in the bottom of the harbor in St. Pierre for quite a while. The other thing they were doing was they actually outfitted some of these boats as tankers. So they would have tanks, several 1,000-gallon tanks, a string of them. And there were some of the boats that were built up in Nova Scotia. And these are boats probably around 100 to 120 feet, and again, low silhouette. And towards the end of Prohibition, it was becoming very problematic with the speedboats. So they were taking bigger risks because everybody was ratting on everybody else because you had all these rival gangs. So maintaining a steady supply on a regular route became more difficult. So people were taking bigger chances. So they would outfit these boats, these 100, 120-foot boats that would just go in and they would make one big shot. And the cost of the boat would be paid for twice over if they were successful at it. Mm-hmm. And they were actually surprisingly successful. And a lot of it because by this time they were also paying off the Coast Guard crews. There was a lot of corruption both on the shore side and in the Coast Guard crews. There's numerous accounts of the Coast Guard guys getting busted. In fact, in some cases, the patrol boats were actually paid to bring loads in. And with a limited number of arrests, you have to assume that there were more successful operations like that. So, the Coast Guard unfortunately got a bad rap in many cases in the public eye for that. But these tankers would come in, and people would set up shoreside facilities, so they'd run a pipe down to the shore. Tanker would come in, and they'd be able to pump it out. It didn't really work out that well. There were only two boats that were outfitted like that, and they made a few runs. But there were a couple of attempts to build submersible vessels. It's kind of like like the narco subs that they've got
towables,
now. Yeah. So there were, and those didn't work out really well either. But the thing is, it's remarkable if you can build a pretty big boat with a low enough silhouette, and it's really hard to see it. This is pre-radar. Out on the bay, whenever I go out there, I'm always looking around. Where's the rum runner right now? And it's not till they're right just about on top of you that you really see it. If she's out by Castle Hill, I'm like, what's that? You can't see her out there.
Yeah.
Any other boat, you can, I can pick out by the silhouette, but the rum runner is
blends right in.
And she's got more stuff up in the air than she would have when she was first built. So, and actually, Charlie Travers, the last time he was arrested for liquor smuggling by water, because he actually had a very colorful history of creative liquor enterprises. They brought this boat, the Amacita, in. She was a 110-footer, and they brought her into is, I think it's at Nascatucket Bay, which is over by West Island in Fairhaven. They came in there, and the Coast Guard just got lucky and busted them just as they were unloading it. And the crazy thing is the Coast Guard boat that they were busted by was the old Tramp, which had been converted to a Coast Guard cutter.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think you answered it, but one of my questions that I'd written down when they were heading out to go meet the boat or coming in, and the Coast Guard would presumably see them, were they pretending to be doing something else? Like, did they have fishing poles over the side, or did they knew what they were up to?
Well, I mean, it was crystal clear what they were up to.
Yeah, and no attempts to disguise it like a fishing trip or.
Well, they'd say, I mean, maybe they did have a couple of fish. They'd always say, "Hey, we're just going out fishing or sightseeing or something," and maybe, but everybody knew.
Yeah.
But the thing is, legally, you couldn't stop them for going out.
No.
You had to catch them coming in with booze on board. And it was the same thing with the guys who were outside. In fact, Bill Mccoy, he was very careful to say, he wasn't breaking the law. He was just out there. We know we know what international boundaries are, and we know what we can get, what we can do, and still be within what's legal. Now, the guys running the boats in once there's booze on board, they knew it wasn't legal. But there were many cases where boats were caught. I mean, it was interesting when the 12-mile limit was put in place. That was in 1924, I think, or early 25. It was May 25. It wasn't really a 12-mile limit. It was 1 hour's steaming.
Ah.
And it was codified later as a 12-mile limit. But the initial language in the law was 1 hour's steaming was the international limit. If the boat did 10 knots, it was a 10-mile limit. And there were cases where a boat was caught, and they said, well, and they're inside the 12 miles, and they're able to plead their case in court and say, well, really, our boat's slow, so
yeah,
it's like. And
that's interesting. I didn't know the origin of that 12-mile line.
Yeah, yes, and really the U.S. because every other country at that point in time was 3-mile international limits. So.
You still see, I believe you still see both demarcations on the chart.
Well, you see the 3 miles is a state, that's a state demarcation now.
Oh, okay.
And if you look at the wind turbine locations off of Block Island, they're just outside of that. They're right on that. So they're in federal water, not in state waters. It makes sense on other ways too, but I'm sure that there's some kind of regulatory element that would factor into the sighting. I'll probably get a call from the wind turbine guys saying you're full of crap. But it is interesting that they're just outside that 3-mile line.
Yeah. Did you want to touch on the film at all, or do you just want to leave it at that? The project that you're involved with it's
still very much a work in progress. And we're editing now. The COVID pandemic certainly threw a monkey wrench in the work in many ways. I mean, just a simple thing like the editor and people he work with, they've all got kids at home. So all of a sudden, just the dealing with having children at home complicates their lives. So, but it's given us an opportunity to explore a few other things that we wouldn't have. But the other big problem for us is all the archives are closed.
Right.
And there are certain things. We've had a couple of trips down to the National Archives in D.C., but every time you go there, it's kind of like you say, "Oh, now we can see that there's more here." Like we want to dig into the intelligence files a little deeper because we know there's a lot of material there. We've been working with Mystic Seaport. They've actually had some great resources for plans for a lot of the Lawley builds are there. And some of the McGinnis plans. But then it turns out that the Black Duck plans are up at the Hart Museum, which is MIT, and they were shut down for COVID. But at the same time, that rolled into, they've got a 2-year construction project to build a new facility for all their collections. So we know that the Black Duck plans are there. We can't get at them for another 2 years now. It's like, but that's okay. We've got, plenty to work with. I mean, what I can say about the filming, it was crazy in terms of, we did all the on the water filming, not this last November, the November before that. It was long days, and it was cold. So like it was like a full immersion experience in terms of what these guys really were dealing with on the rum boats, because their life out there, I mean, they were doing this year round, and they made more money doing it in the winter than they did in the summer.
Mm.
And, you know, these boats had no creature comforts in them. I mean, and we've gotten really used to all this nice technical clothing we have these days. You know, I mean, these guys are wearing wool sweaters and oilskins and stuff. And man, these guys, it gave me a huge appreciation for what tough characters they were, but also what great mariners they were. Because,
Sure.
you know, you're going out there and now you're 20, 30 miles off the coast, and you're banging around. And in a boat, I mean, these contact boats are built light because they had to be fast. And they're banging against the sides of some cargo ship out there when you're trying to get your load of booze off. And then they've got to run it in, and they've got to, you know, and navigationally it's tough because they've got to maintain some kind of speed coming in too. And all the while you're trying to avoid getting caught by the Coast Guard. You know, I gained huge respect for what they were doing. And it's not like they just did it every, you know, once a month. They were out there. Every night they could do it, you're out there doing it.
I did watch the trailer that you've got on the website, so I'll direct people to that
Cool.
as a teaser.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate this history lesson, and like you said, there's all kinds of paths you can go down. And is it true? I don't know if I read this somewhere. We talked earlier about Captain Bill McCoy. Is that where the expression "the real McCoy" came from? Because he did not water down his booze, or is that
that's another rabbit hole?
Oh,
but
sorry.
Our version is yes, that's definitely the case. And there's claims of other uses earlier. But in terms of making it a widespread use, I mean, you know, anytime you go into these any of these sayings, usually there's a backstory and another backstory and another backstory. So the thing that we have to refer to here is the thing that drives it into widespread popular use, and certainly Bill McCoy is responsible for that. And because he was credited with being the guy that would take, I mean, other operators were known for cutting their booze to increase their profits, but he was really proud of being a real straight shooter and making sure that he took care of his customers. And he also captured the popular imagination. You know, you remember I told you about him dragging the reporter for the New Bedford Standard Times out with him.
That's unbelievable.
And there's great, if you want to see some great images, the Mariners Museum down in Newport News has a collection of photographs of Bill McCoy on the Arethusa doing everything from having a cookout with some friends, and he was a teetotaler, by the way. So we do this.
Oh.
Yeah, and so he's not drinking at any of them. Catching fish, playing with their machine gun. he had a deck-mounted machine gun on board just to, you know, because hijackers were an issue back then. People coming on and trying to steal your money and booze. Yeah, he was a character. And he actually, there's a fellow down in Mystic, Connecticut, Bailey Pryor, who did a documentary on him, which is really worth seeing. I think you can get it on YouTube. But you can go to Bailey's website, and Bailey's kind of instructive here because he's another person who got fascinated with some aspect of this. And he actually was a filmmaker. He worked for Warren Miller. He was the president of Warren Miller Films for a long time. And he's he's gotten a number of Emmy Awards for his filmmaking. He's done documentary films. Did one recently on the effort with the Morgan to get, you know, the more recent rebuilding, and then when they went on their trip around New England. But Bailey got fascinated by Bill McCoy and did a documentary on him. In the course of which, what does he end up doing? He ends up founding a rum company. So that's become his new main gig. He's the real McCoy rum. And it's gotten great reviews, and they're cranking out product. And I think they just got one of the major liquor companies just bought a controlling share in it, I think.
Wow.
So he's doing really well. And we went down and talked to him and did an interview with him for some of our background material on Bill McCoy. And he's got a test still, like a sample distillery set up down in Stonington, Connecticut, he imported that from Scotland. I guess it's the only one in the country for this kind of still to do test batches that's still scalable for large production. But interesting character.
Well, thanks. This has been great, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this.
No worries, Chris. It's always good to talk.
All right.
I love what you're doing here. It's really fun.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Maybe that's what makes it fun.
Well, folks, there you have it. That was my fantastic conversation with John Taft about all things rum running, smuggling booze, boat construction, all good stuff. As I mentioned at the beginning, at the end there, we talked about the film that is in progress. It's been on hold right now. The website, if you want to visit that to get updates, it's blackduck.org, and it's black-duck.org, O-R-G. And on that website, you can sign up for their mailing list. I think they've got social media links. There is a trailer on the website, bits of the film, that sort of thing. I also want to mention, some of my astute listeners may have observed that I've got new little intro music there. Finally replaced my horrible guitar jingle. And I want to give a shout out to Nela Ruiz from Argentina. She's a musician and musical composer. Made that little jingle for me. You can follow her on Instagram at Nela Musica. That's Nelamusica. And I will also put a little note in the show liner there if you want to check out those links. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you for listening to Standing Before the Mast podcast with Chris Heaton, sponsored by Newport Nautical Supply. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.